This is Matthew John Ramos. Today is June 18, 2025, 8:18 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. This is part 30 in the reading for the 94th Congress, Second Session, Senate Report Number 94-755, Foreign and Military Intelligence, Book 1, Final Report of the Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with Respect to Intelligence Activities, United States Senate, together with additional supplemental and separate views. April 26, Legislative Day, April 14, 1976. U.S. Government Printing Office, Washington, 1976. Document. On part 29, I last left off on this part on page 355, so here is where I intend to resume now. All requirements levied on NSA must be for foreign intelligence, yet the precise definition of foreign intelligence is unclear. NSA limits its collection of intelligence to foreign communications and confines its activities to communications links having at least one foreign terminal. Nevertheless, this is based upon an internal regulation and is not supported by law or executive branch directive. Although NSA limits itself to collecting communications with at least one foreign terminal, it may still pick up communications between two Americans when international communications are involved. Whenever NSA chooses particular circuits or, quote, links, and quote, known to carry foreign communications necessary for the production of foreign intelligence, it collects all transmissions that go over those circuits. Given current technology, the only way for NSA to prevent the processing of communications of U.S. citizens would be to control the selection, analysis, or dissemination phases of the process. Communications intelligence has been an integral element of United States intelligence activities. Foreign communications have been intercepted, analyzed, and decoded by the United States since the Revolutionary War. During the 1930s, elements of the Army and Navy collected and processed foreign intelligence from radio transmissions. Much of their work involved decryption as well as enciphering United States transmissions. Throughout World War II, their work contributed greatly to the national war effort. Since President Truman authorized NSA's establishment in 1952 to coordinate United States cryptologic and communications activities, tremendous advances have been made in the technology of communications intelligence. These advances have contributed to an expansion in demands for a wider variety of foreign intelligence and of requirements placed upon NSA/CSS SIGINT personnel, or SIGINT personnel, and resources. As new priorities arise in the requirements process, greater demands will be placed upon NSA. It is also necessary to face the problem of integrating intelligence requirements for foreign policy and national security with constitutional restraints and safeguarding of domestic civil liberties. NSA's intercept programs and possible violation of Fourth Amendment rights are discussed in the section, quote, National Security Agency Surveillance Affecting Americans, end quote, in the committee's Domestic Intelligence Report. Section E, Military's Counterintelligence and Investigative Activities. Subsection 1, Background. The Department of Defense defines, quote, military counterintelligence and investigative activity, end quote, as all investigative activity apart from foreign intelligence gathering. Although this nomenclature is relatively, end of page 355, beginning page 356, recent, the military services have always conducted investigations. None of these investigative activities are expressly authorized by statute. Rather, they have been justified as necessary to the military mission. On occasion, investigative activity by the military has exceeded measures necessary to protect or support military operations. In 1917, for example, Colonel Ralph van Diemen, or Deman, of the Army Intelligence Bureau recruited civilians in the Army, Reserve, and used volunteer investigators to report on, quote, unpatriotic, end quote, conduct. Von Demann's men were soon dispersed throughout the country, infiltrating such organizations as the Industrial Workers of the World, mingling with enemy aliens in major cities, and reporting on all types of dissenters and radicals. Much of this civilian surveillance continued after World War I, particularly in the area of labor unrest. In the 1920s, the Army had, quote, war plans white, end quote, to deal with anticipated uprisings of labor and radicals. In 1932, the Chief of Army Intelligence collected information on the, quote, bonus marchers, end quote, arriving in Washington, D.C. Similarly, the activities of the Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI, have not always been restricted to military affairs. Traditionally, ONI, Office of Naval Intelligence, has provided security for naval contractors, guarded ships, search crews, detected illegal radio stations, and investigated naval personnel, enemy sympathizers, and civilians whose activities were, quote, inimical to the interests of the Navy, end quote. Then, in the late 1960s, during a period of considerable civil unrest in the United States, the three services, particularly the Army, were called upon to provide extensive information on the political activities of the private individuals and organizations throughout the country. Footnote 36. Pausing the reading to read footnote 36. For a detailed description of this and other improper military investigative activities, see the Select Committee's report entitled, quote, Improper Surveillance of Private Citizens by the Military, end quote. Resuming the reading. Subsection 2. Areas of Investigation. Department of Defense's counterintelligence and investigative activities are conducted for many purposes, both within the United States and abroad. Footnote 37. Pausing the reading to read footnote 37. Examples include investigations of security leaks, investigations in support of the Secret Service, investigations of theft at the facilities of government contractors, and investigations, once military forces have been called in, to suppress domestic violence. None of these activities, however, currently represents a significant expenditure of investigative effort. Military intelligence units also have certain counterintelligence functions to perform which relate to a unit's combat responsibilities. Resuming the reading. Subsection A. Violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The UCMJ is a code of criminal laws which applies to all military personnel of the Department of Defense. The Secretary of each military department is responsible for enforcement of its provisions within his department. Investigations of UCMJ violations take place within the United States and in foreign locations where personnel are stationed. Subsection B. Security clearances. The Department of Defense conducts background investigations to determine whether to award security clearances to its military and civilian personnel or to the personnel of civilian contractors. These investigations are done both in the U.S. and abroad. End of page 356, beginning page 357. Subsection C. Counter-espionage. Under an agreement with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, footnote 39, each of the military departments conducts counter-espionage investigations on military and civilian members of their respective military departments, although such operations are controlled by the FBI. Pausing the reading to read the footnotes. Footnote 38. The counter-espionage investigations of the Department of Defense are described in detail in a classified staff report of the committee. Footnote 39. The Delineations Agreement of 1949. Each of the military departments has promulgated the agreement as a departmental regulation. Resuming the reading. In overseas jurisdictions where military commanders have control over occupying forces, the military departments are more latitude to conduct counter-espionage investigations, but these are coordinated with the Central Intelligence Agency. Counter-espionage investigations may be offensive or defensive in nature. Offensive investigations seek to obtain information on the purposes or activities of hostile intelligence service. Defense counter-espionage investigations involve the identification of military personnel who are working for agents of a hostile intelligence service. Counter-espionage operations are undertaken in both domestic and foreign settings. Subsection D. Threats to Department of Defense personnel, property, and operations. This type of investigation is distinguished from a counter-espionage investigation because no hostile intelligence agency is involved. Rather, the quote threat end quote typically arises from civilian groups and individuals whose activities might subvert, disrupt, or endanger the personnel, property, or operations of DoD, while quote threat end quote information is normally obtained from local law enforcement authorities. The military has traditionally reserved the right to conduct its own investigations of such matters, both in the U.S. and abroad. In summary, one should remember that, quote, military counter-intelligence and investigative activity, end quote, is not a static category. It includes investigations undertaken for any reason apart from foreign intelligence collection. These range from investigations of lost property to investigations of fraud at servicemen's clubs. Moreover, the fourth general categories cited above expand and contrast to meet challenging military needs and demands from the executive. Subsection 3. Supervisory structure. The Secretary of Defense is ultimately responsible for all counterintelligence and investigative activity conducted by the Department of Defense. However, the Secretary has delegated management responsibility for this activity to the Assistant Secretary of Defense, Comptroller. Footnote 40. Pausing the reading to read footnote 40. Department of Defense Directive 5118.3. Resuming the reading. He, in turn, has delegated this responsibility to the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Comptroller, who was assigned responsibility for the Defense Investigative Program Office, DIOP. The Defense Investigative Program Office apportions counterintelligence and investigative resources within the Department of Defense. The office has budgetary control of funds allocated for these activities and provides policy guidance. However, although DIOP stays informed of activities of the investigative agencies, it does not exercise formal operational control over them. In fact, no element at the OSD level exerts centralized operational, end of page 357, beginning page 358, control over counterintelligence and investigative activities. Footnote 41. Pausing the reading to read footnote 41. The Defense Intelligence Agency made an unsuccessful effort to gain control of these activities in the late 1960s. Resuming the reading. The one Defense Department agency engaged in such activity, the Defense Investigative Service, DIS, and the three military departments largely retained independent operational control, of their own activities. Subsection 4. The Defense Investigative Service, DIS. The Defense Investigative Service is the only defense agency established specifically to carry out counterintelligence and investigative activities. Footnote 42. Pausing the reading to read footnote 42. The National Security Agency and Defense Intelligence Agency also have small elements with counterintelligence and investigative functions. These elements exist solely to protect the activities of the agencies which they are a part. Resuming the reading. Created in 1972, its chief function is performance of all security clearance investigations for civilian and military members of the Department of Defense, as well as for all members of the defense contractors. DIS has also has been assigned responsibility for conducting, quote, such other investigations as the Secretary of Defense may direct, end quote, thus making it a special investigative arm of the Secretary. Footnote 43. Pausing the reading to read footnote 43. DoD Directive 5105.42. Resuming the reading. DIS performs the special function of operating a computer index known as the Defense Central Index of Investigations, DCH. This computerized index, which contains not only references to previous security clearance investigations, but also references to virtually every DoD investigation conducted in the past. Footnote 44. Pausing the reading to read footnote 44. The DCH is routinely purged of references to files which have been destroyed because of their age, files on deceased subjects, or files which DoD directives have stipulated may not be retained. Resuming the reading. According to recent congressional testimony, the DCH now contains references to DoD files on approximately 15 million Americans. Footnote 15. Pausing the reading to read footnote 15. Testimony of David O. Cook, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Comptroller, House Subcommittee on Government Operations, 1975, unpublished. Resuming the reading. DIS does not maintain the files but indicates to requesters which DoD counterintelligence and investigative agency holds the files. DIS has 280 offices across the United States, staffed by 2,620 military and civilian employees. DIS does not have personnel located overseas, but is responsible for security clearance investigations that may require tracking down leads overseas. Normally, an overseas element of one of the services would support DIS in such cases. Subsection 5. The military departments. In the Navy and Air Force, all counterintelligence investigative activity, in both domestic and foreign contexts, is centralized in one element. In the Army, such activity is dispersed. Subsection A. Navy. All foreign and domestic counterintelligence and other investigative activity in the Navy is carried out by Naval Investigative Service, NIS. The Director of NIS reports to the Director of Naval Intelligence, who has responsibility for foreign intelligence gathering by the Navy. He, in turn, reports to the Chief of Naval Operations. In 1975, 169 military and 744 civilian personnel, footnote 46, were assigned to NIS. Pausing the reading to read footnote 46. NIS agents are all civilian employees. End of page 358. Beginning page 359. Subsection B. Air Force. All Air Force investigative activity is carried out by the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, AFOSI. In contrast to NIS, the director of AFOSI reports to the Air Force Inspector General. In 1975, AFOSI had 1,537 military and 384 civilian personnel assigned to it. Subsection C. Army. In the Army, criminal investigations are separated from other types of counterintelligence and investigative activity. They are carried out worldwide by the United States Army Criminal Investigation Command, the director of which reports directly to the Army Chief of Staff. Remaining counterintelligence and investigative activities are apportioned between the United States Army Intelligence Agency, USAINTA, and the military intelligence units located overseas. The United States Army Intelligence Agency has responsibility for all activities within the United States and in overseas locations where military intelligence units are not located. Where military intelligence units are part of Army forces stationed overseas, example, West Germany and Korea, they ordinarily carry out counterintelligence and investigative activity in their respective locations. Where an investigation proves to be beyond their capacity, USAINTA elements may be called upon. Both the commanding office of the United States Army Intelligence Agency and the commanders of military intelligence groups overseas report to the Army Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence, who is responsible for the foreign intelligence gathering activities of the Army. In 1975, the Army had assigned 2,822 military and 1,346 civilian personnel to counterintelligence and other investigative activities. Subsection 6. Results of Select Committee Inquiry. The Select Committee carried out an extensive investigation of the counterintelligence and investigative activities of Department of Defense, insofar as they have resulted in illegal and unwarranted intrusions into the political affairs of civilians. The results of the investigation are published in detail in the committee report entitled, quote, Improper Surveillance of Private Citizens by the Military, end quote. The committee found that while certain of DoD's past counterintelligence and investigative functions resulted in the collection of information on the political activities of private citizens, Department of Defense has effectively brought its counterintelligence and investigative activities under control since 1971. The committee found that DoD currently maintains little information on unaffiliated individuals. That which it does maintain arguably falls within the terms of the department's internal restrictions. Similarly, the committee found that operations against civilians had been authorized in accordance with departmental directives. Despite the success of the department's internal directives to limit intrusions into the civilian community, the committee nevertheless finds them inadequate protection for the future and recommends that more stringent legislative controls be enacted. Section F. Chemical and biological activities. The terrible wounds inflicted by chemical weapons, such as chlorine and mustard gas, in World War I, spawned international attempts to ban their use in warfare. The 1925 Geneva Convention succeeded, end of page 359, beginning page 360, only in banning first use in war of chemical and biological weapons. The United States signed this convention, but Congress failed to ratify it. Thus, the United States was not bound by its prohibitions. Nevertheless, there was a widespread belief that the United States would comply with the convention. Since the ban applied only to a country's first use of these agents, both the Allied and Axis powers in World War II researched and stockpiled chemical and biological weapons in order to retaliate against first use by an enemy. Ironically, as the first president publicly to commit the United States to the policy of the Geneva Convention, President Roosevelt announced in June 1943, with the intent of warning Japan against the use of such weapons, quote, "I state categorically that we shall under no circumstances resort to the use of such weapons, in brackets, poisons or noxious gases, end brackets, unless they are first used by our enemies," end quote. As he spoke, however, he knew the United States had intensified its biological research effort 3 months earlier with the construction of a facility for drug research at Fort Detrick, Maryland. The threat of retaliation against a country using such weapons was effective. Although Germany was thought to have a stockpile, it did not touch it, even in the last desperate months of World War II. After the war, the United States program of research and development on such agents continued in order to maintain a weapons capability sufficient to deter first use by hostile powers. The Army's facility at Fort Detrick remained the center of biological weapons research and development. Subsection 1. Chemical and biological activities. Footnote 46A. Pausing the reading to read footnote 46A. See Chapter 16. Resuming the reading. Against this background, the Central Intelligence Agency entered into a special agreement with the Army on a project which CIA codenamed MK Naomi. The original purpose of MK Naomi is difficult to determine. Few written records were prepared during its 18-year existence. Most of the documents relating to it have been destroyed, and persons with knowledge of its early years have either died or have been unable to recall much about their association with the project. However, it is fair to conclude from the types of weapons developed for the CIA and from the extreme security associated with MK Naomi that the possibility of first use of biological weapons by the CIA was contemplated. The Army agreed that the Special Operations Division, SOD, at Fort Detrick would assist the CIA in developing, testing, and maintaining biological agents and delivery systems. By this agreement, CIA acquired the knowledge, skill, and facilities of the Army to develop biological weapons suited for CIA use. In 1967, the CIA summarized MK Naomi objectives. A. To provide for a covert support base to meet clandestine operational requirements. B. To stockpile severely incapacitating and lethal materials for the specific use of TSD, Technical Services Division. C. To maintain in operational readiness special and unique items for the dissemination of biological and chemical materials. End of page 360, beginning page 361. D. To provide for the required surveillance, testing, and upgrading and evaluation of materials and items in order to assure absence of defects and complete predictability of results to be expected under operational conditions. Footnote 47. Pausing the reading to read footnote 47. Memorandum from Chief TSD/Biological Branch to Chief TSD, quote, M.K. Naomi, Funding, Objectives, and Accomplishments, end quote. October 18th, 67, page 1. Resuming the reading. In reviewing the records and testimony of SOD personnel, it is easy for the most part to distinguish SOD's work for the Army from its work for the CIA, even though very few SOD scientists knew of the CIA connection. For example, the CIA personnel who worked with SOD were identified as military officers from the fictitious SAF or Staff Support Group, whose interest in SOD was markedly different from the Army's. The CIA was careful to ensure that its monies were transferred to SOD to cover the cost of CIA projects, and the few existing SOD records indicate which projects were to be charged against the funds received from, quote, P-600, end quote, the accounting designation for CIA funds. SOD's work for the Army from 1952 until the early 1960s was primarily to assess the vulnerability of sensitive installations, such as the Pentagon, air bases, and subway systems, to biological sabotage by an enemy. In order to conduct these tests, SOD personnel would develop small, easily disguised devices, such as spray canisters and spray pins containing harmless biological agents. SOD personnel would surreptitiously gain access to the installation, leaving the devices to release the biological agent. SOD personnel would then monitor its spread throughout the installation. In this way, SOD could determine how vulnerable the installation was to sabotage of this kind and could advise those charged with the security of the installation on countermeasures. Although the CIA was interested in the kinds of delivery devices which SOD could make for delivery of the biological agents, CIA projects were distinct because they involved the mating of delivery systems to lethal or incapacitating biological agents, instead of harmless agents used in vulnerability tests. The CIA would ask SOD to produce a delivery system and a compatible biological agent, a request not made by the Army until the early 1960s. SOD developed pills containing several different biological agents which could remain potent for weeks or months, and dart guns and darts coated with biological agents. SOD also developed a special gun for firing darts coated with a chemical that could incapacitate a guard dog in order to allow CIA agents to knock out the guard dog silently, enter an installation, and return the dog to consciousness when leaving. SOD scientists were unable to develop a similar incapacitant for humans. SOD on occasion physically transferred biological agents in, quote, bulk, end quote, form. Various delivery devices, and most importantly, delivery devices containing biological agents to CIA. Although none of the witnesses before the Select Committee could recall any transfer of such materials for actual use by the CIA, evidence available to the committee indicates that the CIA attempted to use the material. It is fair to conclude that biological agents and delivery devices prepared at Fort Detrick and transferred to the Staff Support Group were carried, end of page 361, beginning page 362, by CIA agents in attempted assassinations of foreign leaders. However, the committee found no evidence that such material was ever in fact used against a person by the CIA. By the early 1960s, the Army also became interested in the type of work SOD was doing for the CIA. The Army apparently decided that this type of surreptitious delivery device might be useful to special forces units in guerrilla warfare. SOD developed special bullets containing poison darts, which could be fired with little noise from standard military weapons, and small portable devices capable of spraying biological agents into the air, which would form lethal clouds. Ultimately, the Army stockpiled a quantity of these bullets but never transferred them to field units. SOD developed another capability according to existing records, which, so far as the committee could determine, was never tapped by Army or by the CIA. Whereas most SOD work was devoted to biological weapons, which would kill one individual noiselessly with almost no trace of which would kill or incapacitate a small group. SOD did research the possibilities of large-scale covert use of biological weapons. SOD scientists prepared memoranda which were passed to the CIA, detailing what diseases were common in what areas of the world, so that covert use of biological weapons containing these diseases could easily go undetected. SOD researched special delivery devices for these biological agents, but it never made such delivery devices with biological agents. In addition to CIA interests in biological weapons for use against humans, it also asked SOD to study use of biological agents against crops and animals. In its 1967 memorandum, the CIA stated, 3 methods and systems for carrying out a covert attack against crops and causing severe crop loss have been developed and evaluated under field conditions. This was accomplished in anticipation of a requirement which was later developed but was subsequently scrubbed just prior to putting into action. Subsection 2, Termination. All the biological work ended in 1969. Shortly after taking office, President Nixon ordered the staff of the National Security Council to review the chemical and biological weapons program of the United States. On November 25, 1969, he stated that the United States renounced the use of any form of biological weapons that kill or incapacitate. He further ordered the disposal of existing stocks of bacteriological weapons. On February 14, 1970, the President clarified the extent of his earlier order and indicated that toxins, chemicals that are not living organisms, but are produced by living organisms, were considered biological weapons, subject to his previous directive. The Defense Department duly carried out the presidential directive according to instructions and supervision of the National Security Council staff. However, a CIA scientist acquired from SOD personnel at Fort Detrick approximately 11 grams of shellfish toxin, a quantity which was approximately 1/3 of the total world population, and which was sufficient to prepare tens of thousands of darts. This toxin was a known danger. End of page 362, beginning page 363. If inhaled, swallowed, or injected, was then stored in a little-use laboratory at CIA, where its presence went undetected for 5 years. The transfer from SOD to the CIA resulted in a major quantity of the toxin being retained by an agency in a manner which clearly violated the President's order. The evidence to the committee established that the decision to transfer and to retain the shellfish toxin was not made by or known to high-level officials, of either the Defense Department or the CIA. The director of the CIA was told of the possibility of retaining the toxin, but he rejected that course of action. The committee found that the decision to keep the toxin in direct and unmistakable contradiction of a widely announced presidential decision was made by a few individuals in the CIA and SOD. Nevertheless, the history of MK Naomi and the atmosphere surrounding it undoubtedly contributed to the mistaken belief of these individuals that they were not directly affected by the president's decision. The MK Naomi project itself was contrary to United States policy since 1925 and to presidential announcements since 1943, for it contemplated a first use of biological weapons by the CIA, albeit in the context of small covert operations. Moreover, because of the sensitive nature of MK Naomi, these scientists gave their superiors little written record of their work and received little or no written guidance. The National Security Council staff charged the president with determining what U.S. policy should be, and did not discover MK Naomi in the course of its study, and did not, therefore, consider the possibility that the CIA had biological weapons or biological agents. The CIA employee who claims to have made the decision on his own to retain the toxin received no written instructions to destroy them. Kept outside the National Security Council's study, the employee had to rely only on the newspaper account of the president's announcement and on his own interpretation of it. Section G. Meeting future needs in defense intelligence. The Defense Intelligence Establishment poses two fundamental problems for future national policy. The first is how to improve the quality of intelligence and ensure that intelligence collection and production are responsive to the needs of both the executive and legislative branches. The second is how Congress can exercise responsible oversight of the intelligence agencies. These goals require not only executive legislation cooperation in control of the intelligence establishment, but also the design of a managerial and consultative system which is conducive to efficiency in routine activities and adaptive to new priorities. Subsection 1. Anticipating new requirements. It is a truism that generals should not plan for the next war by preparing for the last one. So too, the intelligence community should not simply prepare to predict the last crisis. Ideally, allocation of intelligence resources should precede crises, not follow them. For example, concentration of a larger proportion of intelligence assets on economic issues should have begun before the 1973 oil embargo and energy crisis, not subsequently. In order to anticipate threats, which is the essential function of peacetime defense intelligence, the agencies, end of page 363, beginning page 364, must strengthen their ability to anticipate the proper targets for collection and analysis. The fundamental task of military intelligence will always be to detect the number, characteristics, and locations of enemy weapons, personnel, communications, and intelligence systems. As the world changes, however, the identities of enemies and the relative importance of different security threats change. The allocation of intelligence resources, which was appropriate in a bipolar world, where the most likely threats were strategic nuclear war or large-scale conventional military engagements in the Third World, is less appropriate in a world where power is becoming more diffused. For example, although the energy crisis, which is increasing the spread of nuclear power reactors, and eroding the technical and economic barriers to acquiring nuclear weapons, and the growth of regional power rivalries, which increases incentives to acquire such weapons, are combining to make nuclear proliferation an imminent threat. The Air Force unit responsible for nuclear intelligence still directs virtually all of its assigned technical collection resources against the USSR and China. Footnote 48. Pausing the reading to read footnote 48. The Air Force briefing for Select Committee staff, July 1975. Resuming the reading. In the short range, it is obvious that problems such as nuclear proliferation and international terrorism will be given increasingly high priorities in national intelligence. Since the Department of Defense has the vast majority of collection assets, it should be increasingly involved in these problem areas. In doing so, a new balance may have to be struck between the national/peacetime intelligence priorities of the Department of Defense and the intelligence community as a whole, and the tactical/wartime requirements of the military. The critical problem for improving intelligence in the long range, however, is to identify the mechanisms which are conducted to adaptation, reevaluation of priorities, and flexible distribution of collection and analysis and assets. Feedbacks from consumers of national intelligence, such as policy and research agencies as ISA, DDR&E, State, NSC, ERDA, and ACDA, should be regularized, and DoD should also be responsive to the community-wide committees, such as IRAC, NSCIC, USIB, or IC staff, which consider the interface between issue urgency and collection capabilities. Subsection 2. Effects of new technology. Technological change produces both new capabilities and new barriers in intelligence collection. Unless the U.S. loses its wide lead in capacity for technological innovation, however, scientific advances are likely to be a net benefit. Footnote 48a. Pausing the reading to read footnote 48a, 8a. See the committee's detailed report on intelligence and technology. Resuming the reading. In the near future, expanded computer capabilities can be expected to improve the integration and availability of processed information by use of a central bank with data, pictures, and reports digitized for quick retrievability according to title or substance. This would also offer the efficiency and thoroughness of a full text search, but it also raises the issue of the proper extent of compartmentation. Improved technology also offers hedges against vulnerability and political sensitivity. Developments of unmanned mobile sensors for dangerous peripheral reconnaissance missions can eliminate most of the risks in current collection programs or the potential for crises. End of page 364, beginning page 365. And embarrassments which followed the North Korean seizure of the Pueblo and downing of the EC-121. Both a reduction in risk and an increase in cost effectiveness could be possible if improved technology results in substantial manpower reductions. Technology is interactive. Availability of new techniques for monitoring or verification may provoke enemy countermeasures, and enemy development of new weapon systems can produce the need for new techniques of verification. Heavy deployment of cruise missiles or development of mobile land-based ICBMs by either U.S. or USSR, given, current detection capabilities would create virtually insoluble problems of verification of strategic arms limitation agreements. Development by either side of certain technological innovations, on the other hand, could be undesirable. A breakthrough in the ability to detect and fix the location of submarines, for example, would destabilize mutual nuclear deterrence by increasing the vulnerability of the other side's second strike capability. The complex dynamics of these interactions should require substantive attention to coordinating R&D for intelligence with policy considerations. The expense which goes with technical sophistication also suggests the need for rigorous cost-benefit analysis. In intelligence, R&D, to judge the relative utility of new capabilities. Subsection 3. Restructuring defense intelligence organizations. The pattern of DoD intelligence organization is obviously important for the division of authority and responsibility within the department, but it also has ramifications for the control and direction of the intelligence community as a whole. Internally, there are divergent interests and needs, particularly between the civilian leadership in OSD and the military leadership in the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Unified Commands. Externally, there is an imbalance between the responsibility of the Director of Central Intelligence to direct the collection and production of national intelligence and the predominance of DoD in control of actual assets. Within the defense establishment, there has traditionally been a trade-off in the views of many observers between the peacetime needs of the Secretariat of Defense for, quote, national, end quote, intelligence on general political military developments and trends, and the wartime needs of the professional military for, quote, tactical, end quote, intelligence on enemy forces and operations. This distinction may be eroding since central national sensors can have important tactical applications. Nevertheless, the Secretary of Defense and JCS have different responsibilities and thus different intelligence priorities. Dissatisfaction with fragmentation and duplication of service intelligence support to the Secretary led to the formation of the Defense Intelligence Agency 15 years ago. The DIA was supposed to integrate military intelligence activities and to serve the needs of both OSD and the services. There has been widespread criticism of DIA's performance since it was created. The new Deputy Secretary of Defense position is designed to assert greater control of DoD intelligence from the OSD level. If OSD staff resources or intelligence are increased and DIA's role is decreased, the trade-off between services needed and the needs of the national leadership may be recognized, accepted, and dealt with, in contrast to earlier attempts to, quote, cure, end quote, the problem by combining marginal functions. End of page 365, beginning page 366. In the DIA, there has been a similar potential problem in NSA, although it has provoked far less concern than DIA, since NSA must also serve national and tactical needs. In 1961, the Joint Chief of Staff attempted to gain control of that agency. Footnote 49. Pausing the reading to read footnote 49. Memorandum from the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Lemnitzer, to Secretary of Defense McNamara, March 2nd, 61. Resuming the reading. And in recent years, some critics at the other extreme have suggested taking NSA out of DoD, since it serves many non-military needs. The entire problem of dealing with the mutual relations of the national and tactical intelligence may be clarified as the DCI assumes the additional authority granted to him by the President's Executive Order of February 18, 1976, while establishment of a Pentagon Intelligence Czar in the form of the new Deputy Secretary may reduce fragmentation within the department and improve the coherence of military intelligence. It will probably have a major impact on the coordinating role of the DCI, given that the overwhelming volume of the total U.S. intelligence collection and production occurs within DOD. The Deputy Secretary could become, in effect, a second DCI. The definition of the relation between these two officials will be the single most critical factor in top-level organization for management of national intelligence. Subsection 4. Requirements for congressional oversight. If Congress attempts to exercise more comprehensive and detailed oversight of intelligence agencies, the biggest issue is likely to be what information the executive branch should make available. On defense intelligence, there is likely to be less of a problem if Congress concentrates on issues of intelligence process rather than substance. There is, of course, a limit as to how far it is possible to evaluate the former without considering the latter. Therefore, norms will have to be established about what kinds of material, for example, finished intelligence, will be subject to scrutiny by Congress on a routine basis. Provisions should also be made to keep basic information on budgets and resource allocation in a clear and available form in the Pentagon, obtainable by the Oversight Committee on demand. More consistent and thorough documentation of the chain of command could also be required in internal correspondence, thus avoiding the problem of, quote, unattributable, end quote, records of controversial decisions turning up in the files, i.e., unsigned directives or cables which cannot clearly be traced to an authoritative source. If independent ongoing oversight of the substance of defense intelligence is the goal, an oversight committee should have staff expertise in several areas. 1. Political, to weigh the risks and gains of certain programs and targets. 2. Scientific and technical, to evaluate sensors. 3. Economic, to judge cost effectiveness. 4. Military, to consider non-national strategic and tactical requirements of DoD intelligence. End of page 366. Beginning of page 367. And I'm just going to stop here for this recording.